Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are taking a significant departure from the usual surface-level political coverage.
You really are.
We're moving straight into, the deep waters of the collective psyche, analyzing power not through voting records or policy summaries, but through these profound and sometimes pretty dark patterns of myth and archetype.
That's right. We've compiled a stack of sources that treat a single specific political event, the recent attempt by Donald Trump to rename the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts as, well, far more than just a legal dispute.
Right. They're not treating it like a normal political story.
Not at all. They frame it as a psychological drama, a critical moment where collective memory clashes and clashes violently with pure ego.
And the core question our sources are wrestling with is almost philosophical, isn't it? What happens to a nation when a leader decides its symbols, the shared monuments, the things consecrated to ideals, are no longer a communal memory?
But are instead, as one source put it, just empty walls waiting for his name.
That's a powerful phrase. Our mission today is to use the lens of Carl Jung to dissect this whole event as an attempt at what one source calls identity theft at the level of the collective soul.
I know, it sounds dramatic, but Jung's framework really gives us the language we need to understand these huge shifts. We'll be specifically applying his archetypes of ego inflation, the trickster, and the devouring king.
To understand why this need to possess and rename national symbols is so central to the Donald Trump psyche, not just, some incidental act of vanity.
Exactly. And this brings us right to Jung's central and, frankly, pretty chilling warning. The grave danger posed when a leader becomes possessed by these uncontrolled archetypes.
So this is the unconscious hunger for domination taking physical, institutional form.
Precisely. Our sources argue this story is so frightening because it deals with the corrosion of our collective identity, which is a foundation far more critical than any specific law or budget.
Okay, let's unpack this. We should start with the symbol itself, right? The original intent of the building that's being, violated.
We have to. We must begin with the original consecration of the Kennedy Center, because its purpose is the absolute key to understanding the violation.
So this was commissioned after President Kennedy's assassination, which was a moment of just profound national trauma.
A huge trauma. And Congress had a choice. They could have built a monument to military might or, a structure celebrating conquest, something traditional.
But they didn't. They chose to consecrate art and culture. That feels like an incredibly significant psychological choice for a nation that's just reeling from violence.
It's everything. The structure was conceived as a living memorial. It wasn't about a static image of the fallen leader. It was about the continuing dynamic forces he represented: creativity, intellectualism, dissent, beauty, cultural imagination.
So it wasn't a tribute to domination, but an engine for what? National healing.
National healing and psychological integration. That's the key.
That concept, integration, feels like the critical Jungian term here. It means holding all those complexities: grief, idealism, art, memory, all in one space.
Precisely. Our sources define the Kennedy Center in its founding ethos as a symbol of integration. It's a psychic container where intellect and emotion, national memory and individual creativity are meant to coexist and, mutually nourish the collective soul.
And when a symbol integrates, it stabilizes the culture. It shows that complexity and even vulnerability can be held together.
Yes. But Donald Trump's approach, as our sources analyze it, is not about holding complexity at all.
No, it's the opposite. It's about singularizing, reducing, branding. It's about stamping his own name onto a container that already has this profound, integrated history.
And that is the fundamental difference, the defining moment in the psychological drama. Donald Trump doesn't integrate symbols. He appropriates them.
And from a Jungian perspective, that distinction is everything.
It's everything. Integrated symbols connect the people to a shared past, to ideals larger than themselves, to a greater purpose. They foster stability.
So if I'm following the sources correctly, appropriated symbols do the exact opposite. They don't nourish the culture, what they starve in. And instead, they only serve to inflate the ego of the person doing the appropriating.
They act as a one-way street of psychic energy. They're taken from the collective and instantly magnetized to the self.
I see.
Our sources really emphasize that the moment a shared, integrated symbol, which is, inherently public property, is turned into a private billboard, the collective meaning of that container just dissolves. The purpose shifts from collective memory to perpetual self-recognition.
I think we need a clear analogy here because integration versus appropriation can sound a little academic.
Sure.
Is it something like the difference between, say, contributing to a community garden versus just fencing off that garden and claiming it as your own private estate?
That's an excellent way to put it. The garden still exists, the plants are still there, but its function, who it serves, and who determines its purpose has been entirely inverted.
So when a symbol is appropriated, it no longer serves the culture.
No. It serves the individual's relentless need for recognition, for validation, for symbolic dominance. And this is where the danger for the entire culture begins. The replacement of the collective S with the conquering me.
It forces you, the listener, to really confront this huge psychological shift. If the name on the wall is no longer an ancestor or a shared ideal like art, but it's just a brand, does that national memory still belong to you?
Or has it been claimed? Privatized. It's an act of psychological theft that changes not just the building, but the very nature of American shared memory and symbolic stability.
And this specific act of symbolic appropriation, the sources state, isn't random. It's rooted in a very specific identified psychological pathology that Jung called ego inflation.
Which brings us right to our next section.
Exactly. This is where we have to detail the pattern Donald Trump follows.
Oh.
Ego inflation. Our sources identify this consistent pattern where the inflated ego just cannot coexist with history or shared institutions. It doesn't coexist. It has to overwrite.
And the sources refer directly to Jung's analysis of this state. For a psyche that's dominated by inflation, the past isn't a repository of wisdom or a foundation to build on.
It's what? A threat.
It's an active competitor. History itself is experienced as an arena of rivalry. And crucially, the dead are not revered as ancestors. They're seen as competitors who have to be symbolically displaced to make room for the all-encompassing self.
The idea that history is experienced as a competition that's an incredible insight. That means the target choice, John F. Kennedy, is not accidental at all.
Not in the slightest.
The sources analyze JFK as a very deliberate, specific rival archetype within this narcissistic psychological frame.
Absolutely. The choice is a symbolic bullseye. You have to look at what JFK represents, psychologically and symbolically, and how those qualities directly challenge the inflated ego.
Okay, so what are they?
JFK embodies restraint, youth, intellectualism, sacrifice, tragedy, and a commitment to ideals larger than the famous New Frontier.
And every single one of those qualities stands in direct, profound opposition to the Donald Trump psyche, which our sources define as being centered on, well, visibility, dominance, spectacle, and a kind of transactional loyalty.
JFK is a symbolic antithesis.
Right.
I mean, consider the core contrast. JFK's symbolic legacy is cemented by tragedy and sacrifice. He represented a devotion that went beyond his own self-interest, and it ultimately cost him his life.
And this idea of restraint and sacrifice is just fundamentally intolerable to the inflated ego.
Utterly intolerable, because that ego is built on the pursuit of maximal visible power and the absolute refusal of any vulnerability or surrender.
So the Kennedy Center isn't just a building that's annoying because of policy or party differences. It's intolerable because it represents a symbolic threat to the inflated ego.
Yes, it holds the memory of a leader whose core values, humility, intellectual curiosity, restraint, fundamentally rebuke the narcissistic values of the man attempting the renaming. The building itself is an existential challenge.
That's the essential psychological friction, then. The inflated ego perceives history not as continuity, but as a boundary.
And boundaries are experienced as intolerable humiliation. Every past monument that does not bear his name is seen as a space of erasure, a personal slight.
And this drives the ultimate compulsion. Jung warned that when the ego is possessed by power, its goal shifts entirely. It stops aiming for, say, stable governance and starts aiming for immortality through symbols.
Yes, and this is the direct motivation behind the compulsion to carve one's own name onto institutions they did not finance, build, or substantively contribute to. It is the need to claim the symbolic capital of others' achievements.
It really helps explain that relentless compulsion to saturate the environment with the self.
Absolutely.
I mean, the ongoing attempts the sources document to seek names on airports, on peace institutes, even reported desires to change national currency or other iconic memorials.
The objective here, according to our sources, is not merely recognition. It is total symbolic dominance. This is the ultimate expression of the God complex that Jung identified.
The ego no longer sees itself as a mere participant in the historical narrative.
It sees itself as its sole, indispensable author.
And if restraint is perceived as erasure, then the only way to ensure psychological security and immortality is to colonize every available symbolic space, demanding that the entire environment reflect and validate the inflated self.
It's an unsustainable demand. And it leads directly to the next phase, what the sources call the quiet coup.
Okay, so moving from the psychological why to the procedural how. Our sources detail that Donald Trump did not pursue this renaming attempt through, public persuasion or a lawful, consensual historical debate.
No, the strategy was much simpler, more direct. The removal of obstacles. This shifts the focus to the actual mechanics of symbolic theft.
So what did that process look like on the ground? What were the steps taken to neutralize the established stewardship of the Kennedy Center?
The process described is a blueprint for institutional capture. Boards weren't just reorganized, entire slates were fired. Loyalists, people whose primary virtue was total fealty to Donald Trump, were installed.
And Donald Trump himself named himself chair of the very entity he was trying to rename.
Yes, our sources characterize this as pure, total control, designed to circumvent the institution's internal logic and its traditional stewardship. It was a quiet coup against symbolic governance.
And the sources point to one specific moment as the most revealing archetypal event: the silencing of Congresswoman Joyce Beatty.
Right. She attempted to register dissent, she tried to vote against the renaming, and she was literally silenced. Her microphone was cut, her vote was erased, and the meeting was declared unanimous as if her opposition had just evaporated.
And this is defined as the suppression of the conscience function, which is crucial.
It is. The psyche eliminates opposition, not by debating it or acknowledging its legitimacy, but by just eliminating it from perception entirely.
The terrifying internal logic at play, according to the sources, is if I cannot hear opposition, then opposition does not exist.
That's it. And this is how authoritarian behavior is psychologically rehearsed and normalized within these controlled environments. You eliminate the inner voice of dissent by eliminating the outer voice first.
That's a powerful idea. Muting the mic becomes the physical manifestation of silencing the system's ability to self-correct. And what happened right after that symbolic erasure?
A rush to material reality. The vote was declared unanimous and lawful, and then, within 24 hours, large permanent letters appeared on the building. The infrastructure for the name change was already waiting in the wings.
That speed and finality perfectly illustrate what Jung called window dressing for inevitability.
Exactly. The sources see the ritual of legality, the vote, the declarations of unanimity, as nothing more than a mask covering an outcome that was already decided in the unconscious realm of raw, dominant power.
So the display of lawful process is just performed for the public.
But the underlying intention never, for a single moment, wavered. The outcome was foreordained.
Now we have to analyze Donald Trump's public defense of this because it provides the mechanism of symbolic escape. He famously claimed, "I was surprised, I was honored, I had no idea this was happening."
And our sources identify this denial of agency as the activation of the trickster archetype.
The trickster. This is one of Jung's most psychologically complex figures, isn't it? And one of the most destructive to institutional integrity.
Absolutely. The trickster's primary goal isn't always external deception. Often, he lies to maintain his own internal psychological coherence. It prevents him from having to reconcile his immense need for control with the democratic requirement for accountability.
So he presents as passive, "Oh, it just happened to me," while knowing or even orchestrating the entire takeover behind the scenes.
Yes. He denies intention while simultaneously enjoying the maximal benefit of the outcome. This allows him to claim the honor and the symbolic immortality without accepting any political or ethical responsibility for the highly coercive means used to get there.
So in his own narrative, he's the passive recipient of history rather than its active author.
Exactly.
But how do we, the public, distinguish the trickster's manipulation from, standard political gaffes or just simple deflection? Where's that critical line?
Our sources argue the line is found in causation. Democratic systems rely on visible causation and traceable authority. You need to know who pulled the lever and why.
Right, accountability.
The trickster, by hiding his intention behind this mask of innocence, he destabilizes that fundamental reliance on traceable authority. When power can successfully hide behind the claim of passive honor, the source of control becomes invisible, untraceable, and the law just collapses into theater.
So you can't hold the man accountable for the name change if he claims he was just a surprised, grateful recipient.
The danger isn't that he looks foolish. The danger is that he retains dominance while successfully shedding all responsibility, leaving the system fundamentally disoriented about the source of its own coercion.
Precisely. And this denial allows for a deep, profound contradiction to emerge.
Which is the very contradiction at the heart of the next archetypal pattern.
Right, so our sources move to this layer of hypocrisy, which they define as deeply psychologically revealing. Donald Trump has a documented history of open contempt for the arts.
Constantly proposing drastic cuts to funding for cultural institutions like the National Endowment for the Arts, weaponizing cultural resentment against elite institutions.
And yet, he attempts to place his name on the nation's premier performing arts center.
This profound contradiction is analyzed by our sources as the shadow conquering the symbol it fears most. The shadow, in Jungian terms, is the unacknowledged, repressed, or despised aspects of the psyche.
So in this case, the shadow is the fear or resentment of complexity, beauty, intellectualism, and any kind of non-transactional value.
Exactly. And the shadow doesn't always seek to destroy the object it fears. Sometimes it colonizes it.
It wears its skin.
That's a good way to put it. The shadow colonizes the symbol, emptying it of its original, integrated meaning, art, dissent, beauty, while meticulously preserving its outward appearance. The Kennedy Center would risk becoming a hollow shell.
A monument consecrated not to creativity, but purely to the ego of its new namesake. The sources describe it as an act of symbolic vampirism.
And this cultural corrosion is exactly what Jung warned about. The building still stands, the orchestras still play, but the symbolic core has been entirely inverted.
So when shared national symbols are inverted like this, the culture loses its moral compass. Not dramatically, but gradually and imperceptibly.
We are left with the aesthetic form, but the moral substance is gone.
This symbolic inversion acts as the foundation for the next dominant pattern, doesn't it? The archetype of the devouring king.
The devouring king. This is the leader who commits the fatal error of confusing his personal private self with the state, who perceives no distinction between the national interest and his own private needs for affirmation and wealth.
The sources describe the devouring king as ruling solely to consume. What exactly does he consume?
He consumes institutions, traditions, collective symbols, and most importantly, loyalty. He takes and takes until nothing remains within the orbit of power but absolute desperate dependence on him.
And the devouring king builds monuments.
Yes, but he builds them to erase history that predates him, not to honor it.
So the Kennedy Center was intolerable to this archetype because it was built on shared memory, and therefore it couldn't be instantly owned or controlled. It could only be stewarded.
And the king needs everything to belong to him, to be subject to his will.
Exactly. And that is why the proposed name, Trump Kennedy Center, is characterized in the sources as psychologically grotesque. It's not a legitimate synthesis of two different eras or philosophies.
It's a violation. It is the ego attempting to colonize the self. The imposition of a personal brand onto a collective structure.
And when you attempt to impose a legacy without having done the necessary work, sacrifice, humility, genuine contribution, the sources argue that Donald Trump is attempting to manufacture archetype.
And manufactured archetypes, because they lack genuine cultural resonance or earned meaning, they always collapse into caricature. They're just superficial imitations of lasting power.
It's an impossible, unsustainable violation within the Jungian structure.
The sources emphasize that.
Okay, let's pivot to the public relations component. Donald Trump's main justification for the takeover was this false narrative of rescue, the claim that he needed to save the Kennedy Center, implying it was in bad shape or poorly managed.
This logic is profoundly revealing about the authoritarian personality. Authoritarianism requires a rationale for domination. And that rationale is almost always the invention or the exaggeration of a crisis.
So if an institution is declared corrupt, rigged, fake, or decayed, as Donald Trump has consistently done with courts, media, and other structures,
then the resulting takeover is framed as a necessary virtue, a heroic intervention, not a violation.
And the sources highlight a critical timeline here. The need to control precedes the invention of the story of rescue.
The narrative is fabricated after the fact to rationalize the pre-existing unconscious desire for domination.
It's the perfect psychological tool. This logic allows any institution to be seized. If the military is weak, he must reform it. If the courts are rigged, he must fix them. If the election is stolen,
he must overturn it. Authoritarianism wears the compelling mask of the reformer, justifying these radical acts of appropriation as necessary interventions to save a decaying system that was, only decaying in his mind to begin with.
The drama eventually moved into the legal arena. Let's shift our focus to the lawsuit itself, which our sources analyze through a psychological lens. Law, in this framework, is the collective ego function of a society.
Right, it's the mechanism we've built to set boundaries and prevent these unconscious destructive impulses like greed, narcissism, and megalomania from becoming our national destiny.
And this is exactly why authoritarian and narcissistic personalities have this intrinsically adversarial relationship with legal constraints.
They don't experience law as a necessary protection for everyone. They experience it as a personal humiliation or a malicious obstacle.
So the continuous conflict Donald Trump has with legal boundaries is perfectly consistent with that narcissistic, inflated ego that perceives itself as the ultimate center of meaning.
It's all part of the pattern.
So the lawsuit filed against the renaming attempt is far more than just a bureaucratic action. It represents a massive act of psychological defense.
Yes. The sources describe the legal action as the scattered psyche of a republic attempting, maybe belatedly, to assert a fundamental boundary. You are not the center of meaning. This space belongs to us, not to you.
It's the institutional attempt to recover symbolic integrity.
And we have to return to Congresswoman Beatty's exclusion because the sources argue that her muted microphone was the symbolic castration of institutional conscience.
She represented continuity and legality.
And the legal response is the system's fragmented effort to reassert that conscience function that was temporarily eliminated in that committee room.
And let's look at the structure that enabled the takeover in the first place. The Board of Loyalists. The sources label this governing body the Hall of Mirrors.
A critical psychological environment where Donald Trump surrounded himself entirely with reflections of his own will, not independent minds, critics, or experts.
This sounds like the mechanism of ego enclosure. If the ego can't tolerate contradiction, it has to replace reality with affirmation.
That's exactly right. Loyalty replaces truth, expertise, and integrity as the highest organizational virtue. The board becomes a sealed psychic environment where external corrective feedback is absolutely forbidden.
And reality is determined solely by the needs and desires of the inflated ego.
Which results in engineered unanimity. The decisions feel unanimous because anyone who might disagree has been excluded or silenced.
So opposition feels illegitimate because, within that enclosed environment, no rational disagreement is permitted.
And power feels justified because the loyalty surrounding the leader constantly reflects back his own righteousness. The decision to rename the Kennedy Center when it was presented as unanimous was achieved through silencing and coercion, not genuine consensus.
Now, zooming out to the institution that initially failed to stop this symbolic theft, Congress. Our sources analyze Congress's collective hesitation and failure to act assertively as the wounded father archetype at work.
The wounded father archetype represents authority that has lost confidence in its own legitimacy and strength. Instead of asserting clear boundaries against a symbolic violation, it retreats into calculation, hesitation, and paralysis.
And our sources make this profound argument that institutions decay not through dramatic external coups, but through paralysis.
The failure of legitimate established authority to defend its own integrity when it is challenged. The king sees the wounded father hesitate, and he interprets that hesitation as an invitation to consume.
So the lawsuit, filed by citizens and a few dissenting members, becomes an act of symbolic self-defense by the fragments of conscience still operating within the system.
Desperately trying to reestablish the boundaries the larger institutional authority failed to hold.
And that brings us to the most frightening long-term implication documented in our sources. The collapse of shared reality that occurs when citizens just accept the precedent set by this entire drama.
And what is that normalized precedent that poses the greatest danger? It's the idea that laws can be bent, that symbols can be rewritten, that institutions can be renamed without collective consent.
And that history itself can be edited in real time simply to satisfy the needs of one person's ego.
If this is accepted, then the very foundations of shared meaning dissolve.
And Jung warned that when collective agreement on reality dissolves, societies regress rapidly into tribal psychology.
Where loyalty to the leader or the group triumphs completely over truth, where group identity becomes paramount over the rule of law, and where power becomes more important than shared symbolic meaning.
At that point, democracy only exists in an aesthetic sense. The outward forms remain, Congress still meets, the procedures are still read out loud, but the substance is gone.
The collective consent and the adherence to shared, integrated symbolic boundaries, it's completely gone. The psychological disintegration has already begun, and we're left with a system that performs democracy while living under authoritarian logic.
This deep dive forces us to confront Jung's ultimate total warning regarding narcissistic personalities and symbols. When societies allow leaders like Donald Trump to continually rewrite and possess shared symbols, the next stage is often inevitable: total myth replacement.
And this final, total myth replacement is the complete inversion of meaning. History ceases to be a shared narrative and instantly becomes propaganda designed solely to serve the ruling party.
Memory stops functioning as a collective reference point and becomes a test of absolute loyalty to the leader.
Art moves away from creativity and becomes pure branding, and law stops serving as a protection for all, transforming instead into a performance designed entirely to justify the actions of the devouring king.
The sources make it undeniably clear. The immediate danger wasn't just one name on one building. The danger was the precedent that was established. Nothing belongs to everyone anymore.
Every shared institution, every foundational memory is suddenly deemed up for auction, waiting to be claimed, possessed, and branded by the most powerful inflated ego.
The psychological damage, our sources conclude, has already occurred. The boundary was tested and nearly broken. The silence was enforced via the suppression of conscience.
The symbol was violated, and the public was asked, through the trickster's denial, to simply accept it. Jung believed the greatest danger to civilization was not malicious intent, but unconsciousness. The failure to recognize these profound psychological patterns unfolding in plain sight, disguised as political skirmishes.
And that leaves us with the final provocative thought for you, the listener, to explore. If a nation loses its democracy incrementally, symbol by symbol, name by name, until every last shared thing is claimed and owned by someone, the necessary question will no longer be, how did this happen?
But rather, why did we allow ourselves to forget who we were? Once a culture surrenders the integrity of its symbols, the sources suggest, it has already surrendered its soul.